Huzzah and good day, my wonderful students. Today we begin our study of the Renaissance. The beginnings of the Renaissance. The Crusades had created a desire for trade with the Middle East, because when the Crusaders had gone to war, remember they had originally had established multiple kingdoms in the Middle East before those kingdoms were destroyed. Those kingdoms began to trade with merchants who, of course, had been there with the Silk Road and the spices and the different other exotic items, which were then transported back to Europe along the Mediterranean trade routes. So even when those kingdoms were destroyed, this desire for trade remained. Marco Polo's travels created a desire for trade with China because people wanted to see what the wonders of this other nation on the other side of the world had. And as trade increased, cultural diffusion, baby. That's right, cultural diffusion occurred. And this accompanied a rebirth in learning. The Italian city-states are where the Renaissance first began because of the rebirth in trade there. Now, as more trade happens, more money happens. Wherever trade and money are, that's where the arts flourish. That's where you see universities. That's where you see research. That's where you see different forms of artwork. Many Italian city-states became centers of learning and culture as well as trade. Cities in Europe and other areas became important trade centers because of their locations, mainly along water routes. That is key for trade. People began to become more focused on life, the here and now, instead of the afterlife. They began to focus away from spiritual study and more study on secular things, things that are happening in the actual world. And this brought new respect for humans and our abilities outside of the animal kingdom. Humanism emphasize the value of humans and their abilities, logic and reason. So here we see a rebirth of this concept of humans as very important creatures to be studied and something to be proud of, as well as their abilities of logic and reason, which we had seen all the way back in ancient Greece. That's right, the ideas of the ancient Greeks are being reborn and they're being imitated. And that is one of the importance of the Islamic Empire and the Byzantine Empire having preserved Greek and Roman teachings. It allows this rebirth of their ideas here later on in the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance brought a more questioning attitude. People began to question things, and people were less likely to accept the Bible and the church as infallible. This is going to lead to questioning the ideas of the church, which in turn within 100 years is going to lead into a major split in the church called the Protestant Reformation, which we will be studying later in the chapter. But it starts with people questioning whether or not the people in the church are actually speaking the truth or speaking the ideas or the will of God. Renaissance writers. Famous one is this man here, Niccolo Machiavelli. He wrote a book called The Prince. Now, this book described how Machiavelli believed government worked, specifically what form of government would be best. And, of course, recognizing at the time that Machiavelli lived, cities and countries were run by kings and princes. And so that's why this book is called The Prince. In it, he said, the end justifies the means. Well, what that means is it doesn't matter how you get to your goal as long as you succeed in that goal. So basically, he said it was okay for any leader to murder or kill or lie or do any other number of things that we would consider against the law as long as it made the country stronger. And later dictators would eventually take these ideas and use them. But even people in pursuit of a good idea could fall under this, the end justifies the means. If you think your ideas are good, then maybe you might be willing to break the law to do that. Now, Machiavelli would say that that's a perfectly good thing to do, but we recognize today that if people are going to have natural rights, if people are going to have those rights protected, then the government must follow the rules of protecting those rights. Machiavelli would not have agreed with that. Machiavelli also said it was better for a ruler to be feared than loved. And one of the main ideas of this is if you love somebody, sometimes you don't do what they want. But if you're afraid they're going to murder you, which is what the king could do legally, then you probably won't disobey the king. So if you're more likely to disobey someone you love than someone you fear, Machiavelli said, well, I guess it's better for the king to be feared, because then no one will disobey him. Many Renaissance writers focused on human logic and reason, and even if you don't agree with Machiavelli's ideas, I certainly don't, you can understand the logic of his thinking of, well, this is the way things are going to get done, so this is the way things should be. And this is part of that humanist idea. Renaissance artists. Leonardo da Vinci, that's not pictured here, but this is his painting. This is his painting, the Mona Lisa. Artist, inventor, mathematician, scientist, musician, rock star. No, he wasn't a rock star, but he was what we call a Renaissance man. A Renaissance man is someone who is a master of multiple things. Artist, inventor, mathematician, scientist, musician. So when you ever hear the term a real Renaissance man or a real Renaissance person, they're a person who are very capable at multiple different ideas and things. Michelangelo sculpted the famous statue David and painted the Sistine Chapel. Renaissance art was greatly influenced by classical Greek art and classical Roman art. Makes sense because it's at this time that these ideas are being revived and imitated. Wealthy patrons supported art and education. One of the ways that artists would get paid was these wealthy merchant families wanting to appear more stylish would pay for these artists to paint these paintings or to sculpt these things. And like the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo was commissioned by the Pope to paint the Sistine Chapel to beautify the church. It is how this money supports these artists. These artists did this for pay. Now, the ideas of the Renaissance spread very quickly, relatively speaking for the time, due to the development of the printing press. In 1450, Johann Gutenberg was the first European to develop a printing press. It's actually really funny. He made it out of a modified wine press, which is why it's called the press. A wine press is what you would use to squeeze the juice out of the grapes to make the wine. But one of the most amazing concepts here, and I really want you to think about this, is that the printing press is actually very similar to your cell phone. Obviously, you're not going to be texting anyone on the printing press, but bear with me for a minute. Now, what you had in the past was knowledge, and this knowledge was locked up in these items called books. And these books were very rare. It was very difficult to get a hold of them because every single book before this in Europe had to be handwritten, hand copied. And so for a particularly long book, it might take a year or more to write. And as a result, books were very expensive, and so not many people could get a hold of them. Because they couldn't get a hold of them, this knowledge was kept only in certain areas where only a very small group of people, an elite really, could access this information. But with the printing press, this knowledge becomes much more widespread. It becomes available to large numbers of people, and so more people learn to read and write. Literacy rates rose. So the Renaissance led to more people learning to read and write, and thus gave them more access to these ideas. Now I want you to think about your telephone. Before your smartphone came out, I know old Mr. Stone and a few of your other teachers grew up in an age where smartphones didn't exist. So if you wanted this knowledge, you had to go to the library and look it up in actual encyclopedias. And of course, the encyclopedias could be out of date, and some of them might not have the information you were looking for. And so you were out of luck in that particular case. And maybe if you were a little bit later, you could go onto the internet. And certainly that was good as well, but not many people had access to the internet, at least not early on. But if we look in the later days with the smartphone, every single one of you has access to the internet and a large amounts of information. If there's ever any question about something, you can go right to your phone, and with just a few touches of your fingers on a touch screen, you now have access to much of the sum of human knowledge. This is a huge explosion with tons more information than people had ever had in history, and you're at the very beginning of it still. And I can only imagine how much this is going to change your lives and the lives of your children and grandchildren. But it's just a thought there. I hope you enjoyed this particular lesson today.